Okay, guys, so here we are back for part two of our solar off-grid explanation series. In part one, we talked about all the pieces of equipment that you would need, kind of at a generic level, to do the job of an off-grid solar electric system. And I'll put a link either up here or here, one of these sides, and down in the description to that first part if you want to take a look at it. In this part, we're going to talk about the panels in depth, about how we connect them, how we make the choices of how we connect them, and what those choices mean down the line. So again, it's captured in kind of discussion form. It gets a little long and detailed, but I thought it was good to capture it in discussion form. Again, this is a discussion I was having with a friend and neighbor, Taylor, so that he could understand how to go after his own system. So unfortunately, it means I'm not going to be framed real well all the time because I'm really just talking and I'm standing and moving. So, but it's all about the discussion that we're having. So, as always, I'm not a solar expert or an electrical expert, but I have gained a lot of experience by having my own system and through my research. So, I think it's a very low likelihood that I tell you anything that's kind of not true here, but there are some gaps, and I try to point that out. I try to say I don't know when there's a question I don't understand or don't know the answer to or how to explain it, and I try to be upfront about when I might be oversimplifying something, but I think it's still, the discussion is still valid, so hopefully you can get something out of it.
Hi, I'm Brian.
So let's talk panels a little bit. So, as I said before, there are actually 9 panels here.
Yeah.
We've got 6 more down there that we're using. These are not hooked up to anything, although they're, the sun's hitting them. Here's the wires from one of them. These particular panels are 305 watts apiece. So we talked about watts equals volts times amps, right? So you've got to find a way to feed the power that these are collecting, the electricity these are collecting from the sun, to your system.
Yeah.
So you can connect your panels in 2 different ways, in series or in parallel, depending on whether you connect the positives and the positives to each other or the positives and the negatives to each other. So each panel has a positive and a negative lead coming off of it on these connectors. These are, I'm going to cheat a little bit. These are actually T4 connectors. They're proprietary, I think, to this particular panel, but they are compatible with, or at least they claim they're compatible with, something called an MC4 connector, which is a very common connector. And I actually have a couple here. They say they're compatible. So what I'm going to do is, these leads, they're only 2 or 3 feet long or whatever they are. So what I have to do to connect these all together and send them to the system is I'm going to take these, I bought these connectors, and I'll get my own wire, and I'll get it for however long it needs to be, and I'll use this connector to connect that wire to that and connect to this, and then go wherever I need to go.
How do you connect the wires to those connectors?
There's a little kit.
Oh, okay.
There's a little kit basically with little crimp stuff and all that.
Got
So I bought that on Amazon for like $30 or something.
Okay.
And it has 6 connectors, and I need 5 for. It actually has 6 of each, plus and minus, and I need 5. So, but back to the watts equals volts times amps thing, right? Mm-hmm. So these are 305 watt panels. Well, every panel has specifications of kind of what voltage and what amperage it is at, right? It operates at. So these particular panels, and there are different, I don't want to get too far into it, but I mean, they're at different conditions. They'll give you different numbers at different conditions. One condition is for voltage, they'll talk about open circuit, which is basically if you just connected it to itself and there was no load on it.
I've got a silly question.
Yeah.
Before you do that, do you connect all these together? With
We
these?
will.
We
will.
These all connect together with these things.
They sort of.
Okay.
We're about to talk about how they connect together.
All right.
Yes and no.
Okay.
So the voltage on these is at there's V I just said open circuit. The other one is MP, which is, I don't know what MP actually stands for, but it's basically standard operating conditions, nominal conditions. This panel happens to be 32.7 volts, and its amperage is 9.33. If you took those two numbers and multiplied them together, you'd get the 305. So that's your watts equals volts times amps.
Okay.
So what we're going to do when we connect these things together, the way we choose to connect them together is to take those voltages and amperages up, but take them up in a way, as I said, when I have all 15 panels, there'll be, so each panel is 305 watts. When I have all 15 panels, there'll be 4,500 watts.
Okay.
But the question is, how is that number of watts broken into volts and amps?
Yeah.
Because as I told you, my charge controller can only handle 60 amps, 150 volts. So you can't just willy-nilly connect them any way you want. If you connect it, so series and parallel connections do different things to the voltage and amperage. The watts is the watts, and if you take two panels at 300 watts, together they're going to be 600 watts.
Yeah.
It just adds, right?
Yeah.
But what doesn't just add is the volts and the amps that you get out of that connection, depending on how you connect them. If you connect them in series, one thing happens. If you connect them in parallel, a different thing happens. Yeah. So, what we've chosen to do is when you connect panels, and this applies to batteries too, when you connect devices in series, you actually add the voltage, but the amperage stays the same. And this is all, there's a million videos on this, which maybe you've seen. But it starts to make sense when you think about how the system really works. When you connect panels in series, and series, by the way, is, I want to get this right. I can't remember which is plus to minus, and one is plus to plus, okay. Minus to minus, minus to minus. One of those, I think plus to minus is series.
Okay.
So you go plus minus along the way.
All right.
And then at the end, you end up with plus minus. So basically, however many you connected in that series, at the end, you have a plus and a minus, and you can treat it like one. Your plus is over here, your minus is over here, and that's series, I believe.
So series increases the wattage.
Nothing, wattage is wattage. Wattage is power.
Increases the
voltage.
Voltage.
Yes. So
series will give you more voltage.
Correct. So here's what's happening. So my 32.7 volts of one panel, if I connect another panel to it in series, the voltage goes from 32 to 64. But the amperage stays the same. It was 9.33. It's still 9.33. And the beauty of this, and this is what I love about it because I love math, the beauty of this is if you take the time to write all this stuff out, which I did at one point, you can see how it still is true, though, that watts equals volts times amps.
Yeah.
So when you connect two together or three together, the volts go up, the amps stay the same, but when you multiply those two numbers together, you still get the total wattage. The math always works, which I love about it. But the choice you make about how to connect them in series and parallel has to do with how you want to feed your system. Right. So in my example, for example, I can't go over 60 amps and I can't go over 150 volts, right? Because the charge controller really can't handle it. Right. So.
Another question.
Yeah.
Can you have two charge
You sure
controllers?
can. You sure
And
can.
so
As a matter of fact, some people have suggested that I should. Yes, you absolutely can.
Right.
And sometimes should.
And then you can have more voltage.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
And we'll get into that as well.
Yeah.
There is the possibility that in the future I may add a second charge controller to my system, and we'll talk about why. So the panels feeding the charge controller, ultimately feeding the batteries. What I've chosen, I'll just tell you the way I'm doing it, and then we'll talk about how that math works out. Yeah. What I'm doing is I'm going to have 15 panels. I'm going to connect 3 panels in series. So if you think about it, so our numbers, remember these numbers, and I'll just ballpark them. I'll say it's 30 volts and 10 amps, right? Yeah. And 30 times 10 is 300. So I'm fudging the numbers slightly, but just to make them nice and round. So with each panel, I've got 30 volts at 10 amps. 30 times 10, 300 watts. Okay. If I connect 3 panels in series, So what we just said is when we connect in series, the voltage adds up
Okay.
and the amperage stays the same.
So, yeah.
So 30 volts, 30 volts, 30 volts, 90
90
volts, still 10 amps. The amps stay the same.
Right.
Okay. Well, 90 times 10, 900. 900 watts. 300 watts, 300 watts, 300 watts. 900 watts. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, say it again.
So I started out with one panel,
Yeah.
30 volts, 10 amps.
Yeah.
Volts times amps is watts, 300.
Yeah.
When I add another panel, and when I actually add two panels in series, I go from 30 volts to 60 volts to 90 volts because the volts add.
Right.
90 volts. The amperage of that string of panels stays the same. It still stays at 10.
Yeah.
So if the amperage is 10 and the volts are 90,
90.
volts times amps, 90 times 10 is 900. That should be how many watts I have. Well, a 300 watt panel, 300 watt panel, 300 watt panel, 900.
Yeah.
So the math works out. I upped the volt. So what I did was I took 3 panels, I made them into one big panel by connecting them in series. And at the end of that series connection of 3 panels, I have a positive on one side and a negative on the other side. So now think of it as now one big panel made up of 3. But instead of now being 30 volts at 10 amps for 300 watts, now it's a string of 3 panels that has 90 volts at 10 amps to give me 900 watts. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's one piece of my system. I have now created a string of 3 panels.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do that. So that's 90 volts. What did I say my charge controller could handle? 150.
Yeah.
So I could add a 4th and technically even potentially a 5th, but I fudged the numbers a little bit, so I'm cheating. But technically I could add a 4th panel, would take it from 90 volts up to 120 volts. My charge controller would still be able to handle it, okay? But I didn't. We'll talk about why. Some of it is just to divide things up nice and evenly. So I just created one panel out of a string of 3, one big panel.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that 5 times. So if I do that 5 times, that's 15 panels. That's all my panels. I end up with 5 strings of 3. So think of it as now, instead of 15 panels, now it's like 5 panels, where each panel is a string of 3 panels. So if I do that 5 times, 5 strings of 3. Each of those strings of 3 I can think of as one unit. They each produce 900 watts of power, right? So, but they do it by having 90 volts at 10 amps. 900 watts of power. 5 strings at 900 watts, 5 times 9, 45,
45.
is 4,500. So again, that 4,500 is the same as thinking of each panel individually. 300 watts, 15 of them is 4,500 watts.
Yeah.
I still have 4,500 watts. Power's power, but you can break it up different ways. So we're breaking it up different ways. So I make that string of 3 5 times.
4,500.
4,500.
Okay.
But how are we gonna? I have 5 strings of 3, but that's like having 5 panels. I would have 5 strings, 5 sets of positive and negative wires, right?
Yeah. It's like having 5 panels.
It is like having 5 panels.
Okay.
Like where before I had 3 panels and I made them into a string that had 1 where there was a plus and a minus at the end of it. Now I want to take those 5 strings of 3 that are now like 5 separate panels. I need to get them to act like one panel. How do I do that? I'm going to do that in parallel. That's what a combiner box does.
Right.
So I said the series connection is, so when you asked if we're going to connect all these together, sort of. We're going to take 3 of these, and we're going to take the positive from this one, plug it into the negative of the next one.
Yeah.
The positive of that one to the negative of the next
now
one.
You've got one big panel made of 3.
Yes,
right?
but we're not going to connect it to any of the others.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is, and actually the way it's laid out is kind of nice. So I've got rows made of 3 panels, right? So think of that front row as now so you can see all the little connection points, right?
Yeah.
If I take the positive from there and connect it to the negative of that one, then I take the positive of that one and connect it to the negative of that one.
Yeah.
What am I left with? I'm left with a positive at that end
Yeah.
and a negative at this end.
Okay.
Now think of that as one panel that just has a negative and a positive.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
So when you asked if we're going to connect these together, that's how we're going to connect these together. But we're going to end up with 5 versions of that, with a negative hanging off of here and a positive hanging off of here. what are we going to do with all of those?
Combine.
We're going to connect those in parallel now.
Oh,
So,
right, yeah, of
so
course.
so I
To make
described
it
in
into-
series,
to
plus
make
or minus, plus or
everything
minus.
into one big
Yes,
asshole.
yes.
One big asshole.
So we're going to connect those in parallel. That's what a combiner box does.
Right.
I will run all the positives from one end to the combiner box, all the negatives from to the combiner box. So that's 5 positives,
Yes.
5 negatives coming into the combiner box. In the combiner box, you just land all those negative wires onto a negative bus bar. You take all the positive wires to breakers so that there's protection.
Okay.
And basically it combines them all, and what comes out of that combiner box, now they're like one big panel. So, why parallel? Why did we choose 3 series and 5 of them in parallel? Because
you can increase the voltage.
you can increase now the amperage. So when we did the series, we went 30 volts, 30 volts, 30 volts, and made it 90 volts.
Yeah.
So my system is now 90 volts. It's a 90 volt system at this point. But it was 10 amps.
Yeah.
Well, my charge controller can handle 60 amps. So when I want to send, but that was for just 3 of the panels, which is 900 watts. Now I have 5 versions of that gives me 4,500 watts. How am I gonna divvy it up and feed it to my system? Well, I'm gonna up the amperage now, and I'm gonna hold the voltage the same. So that's what happens when you connect in parallel. When you connect in parallel, the voltage stays the same, the amperage adds up. So for each of these strings of 3, we've got 90 volts, 10 amps for 900 watts, okay? If we do that 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, the 90 volts is going to stay 90 volts. The amperage is going to go from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
The amperage adds up. So now what we end up with, when we put all 5 together, and the way we wire them to the combiner box,
You've now got 50 amps.
now I've got 90 volts at 50 amps.
50 amps, yeah.
Volts times amps, 90 times 50, 4,500. That's your total wattage. The total wattage is the total wattage. When you put 2 panels together, it doesn't matter how you put them together. The wattage is going to add together. The power is the power, right?
Yes.
The total power.
Yeah.
But you can choose whether you want higher voltage, higher amperage, blah, 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 right?
So you're choosing to put the number of panels in serial depending on how much amperage you can get out of your system.
Yep.
I'm wondering why everyone just doesn't go low amp on everything. I'm wondering where the 240, where the large amperage.
Well, okay, there are limitations, right? So the charge controller can handle what it can handle, right?
Yeah.
60 amps, 150 volts.
Yeah.
Let's take an example, right? So let's say we wanted the lowest amperage possible. One panel has 10 amps, right?
Yeah.
Or is at 10 amps. Let's say I wanted 10 amps.
Yeah.
I wanted my system to be 10 amps. Well, the only way to do that, right, is to connect. So we talked about a series connection leaves the amperage the same,
Yeah.
right? So in theory, I could connect all my 15 panels in series, right?
Yeah.
Except, so here's where it breaks down. This is the reason I understand what you're saying, but there's only so much you can do, right? By feed your equipment and for that equipment to work the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
So here's where it breaks down. In theory, to keep the amperage as low as possible, I could connect every panel in series, and my amperage would stay at 10.
Yeah.
What does my voltage do?
Stays this. No.
Amperage stays the same.
Yeah, it goes up.
Voltage goes up.
Yeah.
So every time I connect a panel in series, voltage goes up, right? It goes up by, in this case, 30, because they're all 30 volts.
Yeah.
So think about that. If every panel is 30 volts, and I connect 15 of them together in series, what's my voltage now?
450 or something.
450.
Yeah.
Can my charge controller handle 450 volts? It's a 150. So you have to take your power.
It's determined by what your
It's determined by the equipment.
Yeah.
So, and again, I'm oversimplifying and I'm probably leaving things out, and I might even be answering this sort of wrong, but what I'm saying isn't false.
Yeah.
It just, I don't know if it's really the answer to your question. I don't know if I can really answer your question all that well, but the point is you want to take the power and you want to divvy it up between volts and amps to make your system happy, essentially, and for it to travel and all those things, right? So as we said, it travels best when it's low amperage. So yes, you could make the argument, let me just leave it as low amperage as possible, but the math is still the math. So for it to stay at 10 amps, it has to go to 450 volts. 10 times 450 is your 4,500. That's your total power. But I can't do 450 volts. That's too many volts. So I have to start to play with those numbers. That's what I was talking about. That's why that equation is so great. Watts equals volts times amps. It's always true.
What is it, West Virginia?
West Virginia, WVA. So, it's nice to know that you can, in any system, you can play with the voltage and amperage to get the end wattage that you want. But for any given wattage, and we'll talk about this when we talk about how the charge controller works. The charge controller kind of does this same thing. So we just finished up. So the way I'm going to connect them, we said I'm going to have 90 volts at 50 amps. 90 times 50, 4,500 watts. And that's 90 volts from the panels. Well, my system, this is where it gets a little weird, and I don't know if I'm saying all this right, but my system is not a 90 volt system. My batteries, when we talk about my batteries, they're in a configuration that makes them a 48 volt. My system really is a 48 volt system.
What makes it a 48 volt?
What makes it a 48 volt is the way the batteries are connected. All that logic I just gave you for panels and connecting in series and parallel, it applies to batteries too.
Oh, okay.
So it just so happens that the way I have my batteries connected, my battery setup is in a 48 volt configuration. So when we start to look at the charge controller and how the charge controller is working and what it's taking from the panels and what it's feeding to the batteries and whether the batteries are full or not, that is really based on that 48 number. So my system is really a 48 volt system. Now that sounds a little weird because I said these are at 90 volts, and I don't necessarily know how to explain that all that well. All I know is the beauty of that equation, watts equals volts times amps, is I take all that wattage, 4,500 watts, right? Let's say the sun is at the perfect angle, the perfect height, there's no clouds, there's no nothing, I'm getting 4,500 watts.
Yeah.
I send them in wires over to the combiner box. It puts them all together. It feeds them to the charge controller.
Yeah.
Charge controller gets 4,500 watts of power.
Yeah.
How does it give it to the batteries? So the charge controller has to decide, just like I decided just now, how to break up my volts and amps to send along to the next step. Yeah. The charge controller decides, when it receives the wattage from these panels, it decides how to break it up in volts and amps to feed to the battery. Okay. Because I can't go into all the details of how that works, but the point is, the general idea is, there's a good way to charge a battery, right? There's a best way to charge a battery. Mm-hmm. So the charge controller makes those choices about, okay, given my 4,500 watts that I just received from these panels, I'm going to divvy that up between volts and amps for that equation to work out, because the battery likes the amps to be at this number or the volts to be at this number or whatever. So it actually changes that based on the phases of charging. Maybe you've heard a charge controller can work in phases. There's a bulk phase where it's basically just trying to push as much as it can into the battery. Wow. And then it reaches another phase that's called float, and it kind of just tries to keep the battery topped off. And unfortunately, this is where it gets into, I'm not an expert. I can't explain all these things in great detail, but I can explain them kind of at a high level. So it will become a 48 volt system based on the battery configuration, but it's the charge controller that takes what I feed it and kind of decides how to push it into the battery. The choices I make at the panels, how to connect them, the choices are based on how much that next device can handle. In this case, the charge controller. Yeah. 60 amps, 150 volts, and how far it's traveling. So, for example, the higher the amperage gets, the bigger the wire I need to be able to send it along its way.
Have you got that calculation?
Yes.
All right.
Yes. So, now, the good news is, if you keep your, and again, this is DC, we said we wanted to keep our DC runs short because DC doesn't travel very well. If you put your equipment, your charge controller, your batteries, your inverter, near your panels, that almost becomes a non-issue because they don't have to travel very far. It becomes an issue when the panels are far away from your equipment, that you have to send that DC electricity a long way. Now it becomes an issue. Right. So we just talked about if you wanted to keep the amperage as low as possible, what would happen. Eventually, the voltage gets too high and the next device can't handle it. You could have kind of the opposite. You could say, well, I don't know why you would do this, but let's say I wanted my voltage to stay low. So I wanted to make a bunch of connections in parallel. Again, you could run into the same issue. So I ended up at 90 volts and 50 amps.
Yeah.
My charge controller can handle 60 amps. So if I had made more connections in parallel, my amperage would have kept going up, and I would have had kind of the same problem in the opposite direction, is I would have fed too many amps that my charge controller would go, I can't handle this. So.
That's a good explanation, thank you.
So, and believe me, I've gone through this logic in my head and on paper 1,000 times to get to this point, and there are still, I'm sure, a million nuances that I'm missing, and hopefully nothing I've said is not true, but I'm sure there are gaps in what I'm saying probably. So I'll admit that. But this is the way I understand it.
Cool.
So that talks about how we're going to get the energy from the panels into the system, the equipment that's going to kind of capture it and turn it into AC.